Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him. Because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, "Very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes, oh, you turned me off.
Done? Welcome, Communitas. I can't wait till 5 minutes after I'm done that the whole place fills up. So last week was wonderful to see so many people. Thank you for coming this morning. You might be here because of good coffee, or you might be here because of the snacks, maybe music, although this morning we don't have music. Or we have a new attraction. So here's Boji. This is his first online appearance. Okay, that's enough. So not that we're trying to manipulate you, but we need to socialize our dog. And he is eating away at our fingers, so we think if we share that with others, that's good. We are working on training. I wanted to tell you a little story. When we were back visiting Deb's parents, we were thinking we did that last summer. And we were going to take a trip and go see a car museum. So Deb's folks haven't driven in a long time. They don't get out very much. So we wanted to go travel. And we don't have a car. We haven't owned a car in about 20 years. So we were going to borrow my brother-in-law's car. And we all got in the car, and it wasn't just us, Deb and I, but it was also the parents in the next rows, and then the very back seat was our nephew, 11 years old. His name is Liam. We all got in this van, and I'm driving, and I sit down, and it's a new car, and there's a start button, so you figure you just hit the start button. So I hit the start button, and nothing. Okay, make sure it's in drive, or make sure it's in park, and hit in nothing. And I knew that my wife probably wouldn't know. I knew that my in-laws probably wouldn't know at all. So I have to ask my 11-year-old nephew, Liam, do you know how to start your parents' car? And he said, put the brake on. Okay. I stepped on the brake, pushed the start, and it just started fine. So most of you probably knew that, but that was pretty new to me. And I figured we're not going to be able to travel together unless I get this car started. But I didn't want to ask help from an 11-year-old because at 50 plus, asking technical from a boy made me feel I was a little too prideful, but we weren't going to get anywhere. Or I could think, well, I could blame my dad for not training me on this, even though he trained me on a tractor, and then after that, he just kind of let me go with that. So what attracted me to Communitas in coming was the relationships and the authentic relationships. So we are really glad that you're here. If you're new, it's very understandable to be a little cautious in talking with others, what you want to reveal. But again, I would love for you to feel, to be able to be free to be authentic on where you're at. Most of us have been through about everything. And so we definitely can empathize with you. And so we're really glad you're here. And let's get Mark up for the sermon.
As someone who's also 50 plus and plus, I want to tell Aaron, get real. This is real life. Our day is over, okay? We're done. We don't know anything anymore, and so we just have to realize that it's the other people who know what's going on. But anyway, once again, welcome here. Well, feel free to get coffee or tea if you haven't had a chance to do that. Probably at the end of the sermon, we will sing one song to close out the sermon, a cappella. But yeah, we're still working to solve the regular musician every Sunday situation. But hopefully we are getting there. We're glad that Isaac's family might be available occasionally again. But in any case, not this morning. And so in a moment, we'll turn to the Word. I do want to encourage us to continue to pray for the situation in Ukraine. I put on the post on Facebook about praying that, we have people in our own community who have, friends and relatives there, and so, that situation can become very personal, if not to you directly, to people that you know. And as I might actually talk about, a little later in the sermon, I mean, there, depending on what happens, if things go a certain direction and, maybe there's more Ukrainians arriving in Latvia, at least for a while, then we need to be ready to, to play our part in helping people, who might have a need in the midst of that crisis. But actually, that's in some ways related to what I want to talk about today. So we're winding down to the end of our Acts series. Next week, hopefully he remembers, Rick Dugan is probably going to bring the message on the final chapter of Acts, and then John Woods will be in town with another person, and they're going to do maybe a couple sermons that'll sort of do some big picture things from the book of Acts, and then, sometime probably end of March, early April, we'll begin a new series. But a phrase, I should turn this on, that always helps. There's a phrase that is used a number of times in the book of Acts, and the word way is used because it's a common word, but there's about 6 times in the book of Acts where, that definite article, the way, is there on purpose, and in some translations they actually capitalize it, because it seems like this was a name that was used for the Christian movement at that time. It was sometimes called the way, and so people might not, identify themselves as I'm a Christian or I go to church, but they are followers of the way, or they believe the way. Okay, and that's not found often in the New Testament, but it's interesting that at least 6 times in the book of Acts, that's how the faith or Christianity is designated. It's called the way. And so the question is, what might that mean? Why was that chosen, the way? And the way of what? What were they thinking back then? Now often, I think contemporary Christians, when they think of the way, they're thinking the way to heaven. How do I get to heaven? What is the way to get to heaven so that, when I die, I want to go to heaven? So what is the way to get there? And that might be included in the way, but I think in the early church they were thinking a little bit differently or a little bit more widely, when they referred to their movement as the way. Now, one of the things I've mentioned a couple times that, when I said it, it possibly seemed like just, one of these things pastors or theologians like to talk about, but it's actually very practical. And that is, in the book of Acts, as Luke is writing the story, he's telling the story in a particular way. Okay, I said before that he's a very well-educated man, and he's a very good writer, and he's not just, writing whatever comes to his mind. He's got these stories, but he's organizing them in a particular way, and he's emphasizing some things and not mentioning some other things, okay, because he wants us to follow the way in which he's telling the story to make a particular point. And one of the things I've said is that in many ways the book of Acts repeats some patterns from the Gospel of Luke. Okay, so Luke, the man named Luke, wrote that gospel that has his name, and then he also wrote volume 2, the book of Acts. Okay, and when he planned those 2 books, he had the whole big picture in mind in his writing. Okay, and so one of the things he does in Acts is just find different ways to remind the reader that what's happening in the book of Acts is similar to what happened in the Gospel of Luke. There's a similar pattern. People are doing some similar things. There's some repeated kinds of healings that are emphasized. Jesus healed someone this way, and we find Peter doing the same thing. Okay, and especially if you recall, you who were here a long time ago in the Gospel of Luke, you know, how the whole story is headed toward Jerusalem. Okay, all of the Gospel of Luke is about Jerusalem and Jesus getting to Jerusalem, you know, where he's going to die, and he knows he's going to die there. He's told, and he tells his disciples, we're going to Jerusalem, and by the way, I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be crucified, and nevertheless he goes. Same thing happens in the book of Acts, if you remember. Paul is told, oh, if you go to Jerusalem, this is what's going to happen. You're going to be arrested. And Paul knows that some bad things might happen to him in Jerusalem, but he goes to Jerusalem, and he testifies just like Jesus did before Jewish authorities and Roman authorities. Okay? And this is intentional. It's actually going to be important for where I'm going to drive to at the end of this sermon, is that the life of the church is meant to follow the life of Jesus. Our pattern for what we do and how we look at life is supposed to be modeled on the life of Jesus. The life of Jesus is a model for us. We should expect, as the Church of Jesus Christ, that our experience, okay, is going to be at least somewhat similar to what Jesus did. Okay, Jesus is the model for the church, and the church is now his body on earth to continue the things that he started. Okay, and so that's going to be very significant. In fact, Paul, as he's writing later to the Corinthian church, and we've talked earlier about, you know, the planting of that church, Paul says something that I couldn't say myself. You know, would be very hesitant to say, you know, be imitators of me. You know, Paul was willing to say that at certain times, but notice how he says it: be imitators of me as I am of Christ. You know, insofar as Paul is continuing to live out the pattern of Jesus, which again he did, and we're going to see in Acts chapter 27 how he's following Jesus. To the extent that Paul is imitating Christ, Paul is someone worthy of imitating. Paul lived his life according to a way, according to the way of Jesus. And it's a life that we can follow. In fact, Paul might help us in our own trying to imitate Jesus. Paul might help us, you know, to see what that might look like and what we might expect as we walk through this world. Now, we ended last time with Paul giving a testimony, a very bold testimony before Roman leaders. And all of them, you know, agree that Paul is innocent and he could be set free. But Paul, because he's a Roman citizen, has appealed to the Roman emperor. You know, so he's got to be sent to Rome, where eventually he'll have to testify before the emperor. Okay, and Acts chapter 27 is about that journey there, and it's a ship journey, and it's, you know, if you read it, if you're familiar with the book of Acts, it's mainly about a storm and a shipwreck and Paul's experience there. And I know some of you might not be interested in these kind of details, but in case you're interested, and if you know, don't look at the map at the end of your Bible, this is his journey. He was arrested in Jerusalem. He was taken to Caesarea. That's where he gave his testimony before the Roman leaders. And then from Caesarea, he's going to be sent by ship, ultimately arriving at Rome. And Luke in chapter 27 gives a lot of details of this journey. It seems like Luke was one of those guys who was well-traveled. You know, there's some people who like a good sea story. Luke seemed to like a really good sea story, you know, and so he gives a lot of details of this journey and a lot of the places that they stop. But in any case, you know, these are the places mentioned, including the storm and the shipwreck, and they end up on the island of Malta and then eventually end up in Rome, which is where, you know, the entire story of Acts is headed, to the ends of the earth, represented by Rome. And then this is a typical kind of Roman grain ship. Probably the ship that Paul was on was bigger than that. As we're going to see, there was more than 200 people on the ship, and I don't think that size of ship could have 200 people. Plus, a large amount of grain. A lot of the Roman Empire was fed from wheat that was grown in Egypt, and so there's constantly ships sailing from Egypt to Rome, and so that's why the centurion in charge of Paul was able to find a ship and get on it in order to get Paul there. Anyway, like I said, that's probably not, a detail that might be interesting to you, but you can find these kind of images, easily, type in Roman grain ship, and you can get all the details that you want on Google. But in any case, Paul is being sent to Rome, and he's been put in charge of a Roman centurion, a Roman officer. And this officer finds a ship that takes them part of the way, and then finds a larger ship that's going all the way to Rome. Okay, but part of the problem that's going to emerge in this chapter is that it's late in the year for traveling. Okay, it's getting into late September, October, and generally sometime in October, most of the sea travel in the Mediterranean Sea just ceased. Okay, because there are too many storms, and those kind of ships were, in certain ways, technologically advanced for their time, but were not necessarily safe. Okay, and so they're kind of pushing, the timing to try to get to Rome, in spite of the bad weather. They're trying to just beat the bad weather, okay, and they're not going to succeed. It might be that the captain of this ship is doing this intentionally. Because if he can arrive late in the season, with his load of grain, then he can probably sell it at higher prices. Because there's not many more ships that are going to arrive for a couple months till winter ends. And if he can time it right and get there just at the last minute, he can charge an inflated price for his wheat. So that's kind of what's happening. They're hoping to beat the weather, but it's going to quickly emerge that it's not going to work out for them. One of the other interesting points is this Roman centurion he likes Paul, so in one of the ports, he lets Paul have some freedom to meet his friends. And once again, we're going to see Paul having a tremendous amount of respect by the people around him. How could he be a man who could speak truth boldly and yet still manage to be attractive to people, to Roman leaders that just respected him? Well, they lost a lot of time sailing against the wind, Luke tells us in chapter 27, verse 9. And he says sailing had already become dangerous because it was now after the fast. So Paul tells them, guys, I think that this is going to be a dangerous journey. It could be the loss of the ship. It might be the loss of life. Maybe we need to stop our journey, just winter somewhere, and just wait it out. And then when winter's ended, we can all complete the journey. We'll all be okay. So Paul gives his advice. But in this case, the Roman centurion doesn't listen to him. He chooses to listen to the owner and the captain of the ship, who again, of course, they would like to make it to Rome because they want to make their money. So they decide, we won't listen to this guy, Paul. We're going to try to make it. And so they do. But the wind is against them. And so they find another harbor on the island of Crete that they're hoping they can spend the winter there. They've realized they're not going to make it to Rome, but let's find a nice, comfortable harbor, for the winter where we'll all be okay, and then we'll make it on to Rome, in the spring. But once again, it's not going to work out. The wind is against them, and so they get pushed out into a storm, and the storm gets worse and worse. And that's where we pick up the story in the middle of chapter 27. The weather gets worse, and now the sailors are doing anything they can to save themselves. They're starting to throw things overboard, to just keep the ship afloat. They've maybe given up, making any money on the grain, so let's start, chucking things over the side of the ship. And so now they're doing whatever that they can to save themselves, but it's getting worse and worse, and they no longer have any control over the ship. It's at the mercy of the wind, and it's dark, and they are now hopeless. And so that leads us to now when Paul begins to take the lead. So it says, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, and I talked a couple weeks ago about, Paul playing these cards. Paul plays the I told you so card, okay? And I don't know if this was very diplomatic on Paul's part or not. This might not have been the best move, but he says, guys, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then we would have all spared ourselves this. Okay, you should have listened to me. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. And Paul explains why he is so sure of that message. His earlier message about let's not sail because it could be a loss of life, that was just Paul using his common sense, suggesting that, giving advice. Okay, but now Paul has heard directly from God what God's intentions are, and so he speaks them. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. Before we go on, I just want us to take a moment and reflect on verse 23. The God to whom I belong and whom I serve. And I would just like us to reflect on whether or not this is something that we can say about our own relationship with God. That there is a God that I belong to. And I do serve that God. So I just want you to ask yourself, could I say that too? Could I say, there's a God to whom I belong? Is this a God I'm willing to serve? In terms of personality, probably not many of us are like Paul. I'm certainly not like Paul. He's a very different kind of man than I am. Even though I wish I was like him, I'm not. I don't have his maybe natural confidence or leadership skills. And so it might be harder for us to feel a confidence and we might question, do I know that I belong to God? But I just want us to ask ourselves, can we say that? Would we be willing to say that? Would we be willing to commit ourselves to God? So that even in our questioning faith, in the end we could say, I belong to this God, and I will serve this God. So Paul commits himself to this God publicly and to the message that this God has given to him. So he says, don't be afraid. This angel had said to Paul, don't be afraid. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So this is the assurance that God gave to Paul, now in the middle of that ship, in the middle of a storm, where even the experienced sailors are thinking, we're all dead. We're all going to die here. Okay, this is what everyone is thinking. There's not much hope on that ship. Okay, and Paul, he's had experience, Paul tells us that he's been shipwrecked before, and in spite of no one else around him having any confidence, Paul speaks confidence. God has guaranteed your lives along with me. So keep up your courage. I have faith in God that it's going to happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. In the midst of this storm, some of the sailors decide, we're experienced on seas, so we can probably protect ourselves. If we can escape on the little boat, maybe we can row to shore all these other guys are going to die, but we're sailors, we can save ourselves. And so they start to do that. And now suddenly Paul is taking charge, and he says to the centurion, don't let those sailors go. We need them. Okay, and so the centurion gets his men, his soldiers, and they cut the little boat loose, and so they're all stuck together. Okay, but Paul now is the man who's giving the orders, because he's the only man who's got the connection with God and who's got the confidence to live that way. So Paul says, keep calm and take your courage. Several times we've used the phrase in the book of Acts, keep calm, okay, because the circumstances are not calming. There's nothing going on in the world necessarily, that suggests this is a fine time to be calm. It's all okay. Okay, we don't necessarily know it's all going to be okay, just looking at what's going on out there. To keep calm, to take courage, it is a choice we have to make in spite of circumstances. Paul says, keep calm and take courage. And then especially what Paul does here is really what I want to focus on as we think about what it means to be followers of the way. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. He says, the last 14 days you've been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. So now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Again, he repeats, not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And then it said, when he had said these things very publicly, Paul takes the bread and he thanks God. Okay, he breaks it and he eats. Okay, and in seeing the model of Paul, they themselves take courage and they imitate Paul and they eat some food for themselves. Okay, so Paul with his body is modeling the behavior he's suggesting. And of course, taking bread is highly symbolic. It communicates something. So they're encouraged and they all eat food. And then Luke tells us altogether there were 276 of us on board. And when they had eaten as much as they wanted, then they lightened the ship by throwing the rest of the grain into the sea. It's interesting that Luke gives the exact number because other times in the book of Acts, Luke just gives round numbers or about numbers, even small numbers, like in chapter 19, Luke says there's about 12 people. Was there 12? Was it 13? Was it 11? Luke doesn't really care. It's just around 12 people. But here he gives the exact number. And I wonder if one reason Luke does that is because he might have been one of the ones to count them. Luke is a doctor, and so maybe they enlisted Luke. Would you count the people? But the point of that is everyone going to be saved? To be able to say everyone was saved, they need to know exactly how many people were there. And so they know that there's 276 people here on the ship. And when the ship wrecks and they're on shore, they can count them again. And they can count 276. And they can all see, oh yeah, Paul's God did exactly, precisely what he said he was going to do. Paul said not a single life was going to be lost. And we counted, and not a single life was lost. I'm not going to read the story of the shipwreck. They're nearing the island of Malta. They're lighting the ship to try to get as far as they can to shore. They're hoping that the wind of the waves will just drive them on shore and they'll be saved. Doesn't happen that way. The ship gets caught on a sandbar. It's stuck. The waves break the ship to pieces. Some people dive in and swim. Other people grab some piece of wood, and they all make it to shore that way. And we're even told that on the island of Malta, the natives there helped them. They built a fire. You know, interesting things happened to Paul, including doing some healings and evangelizing, because, of course, Paul never shuts up about Jesus. But here's the point of all of this. When we think about the way, Paul has given, his entire life to God. He sees himself as belonging to God, the God to whom I belong and who I serve. And that has not made Paul's life easier. Paul belonged to God, but God did not make it easy for Paul. God could have stopped the storm, and he didn't. God could have spared Paul 2 years in prison in Caesarea, but he didn't. And now Paul is going to spend 2 years in Rome, and he's going to have some freedom. He's going to be able to preach, but he's still got this weight. I've got to stand before the emperor, and I've got to testify, and maybe he'll let me go, but maybe he'll kill me. And eventually, in fact, the emperor will kill Paul. He belongs to God, and yet his life is full of difficulty and suffering. Just like the life of Jesus. Okay, this is the way. The way is the way of Jesus. And Paul is simply imitating Jesus in a life of sacrifice and difficulty. So what is the way of Jesus? One thing I think we can say about the way of Jesus is it is the way of proximity, or the way of closeness. Okay? The theological term is incarnation. God becomes human. God did not shout from heaven, do this or do that, or be saved. God did not shout from heaven, I love you. God said, I love you, by sending his Son, who becomes human, who is born poor, who has to be fed, who has to work with his hands, who has to live just like everyone else lives. Jesus grows up as a boy in Nazareth, just like every other boy. Wearing the same kind of clothes. He didn't have some holy glow around his head where everyone was like, oh, there goes Jesus. He was just a boy in Nazareth and just a teacher that some people followed and some people didn't. But he shared our life. He was hungry. Jesus was hungry. The Son of God was hungry. And he was tired. Okay. He came close to us, so close that he was just like us. God did not separate himself from us, but he came close to us, literally side by side, in the same kind of flesh. He was incarnated like us. Jesus had a particular color hair and particular color eyes and a particular size of nose and a voice and all of that, and he didn't look like some perfect specimen of humanity, like Michelangelo in a sculpture. He was just a typical person like us. Okay, that was God's way to communicate I love you, by coming close, not separating, but being close to us. Literally, physically close. But it's also the way of weakness and suffering. This was the way of Jesus. Again, so that he would be tired and hungry at times, maybe feel lonely, And of course, at points, feeling abandoned by God, his own Father. My God, why have you forsaken me? And he's on a cross. Okay, the way of Jesus is to be on a cross. That's the way of Jesus. That's what Jesus did. That's what it looks like. For God to save people, it's to be on a cross. It's a way of weakness. And so Paul is sharing the weakness of these people. He's as hungry as they are and as tired as they are. Maybe he's a little less scared, because God has given him this revelation. But it's one thing to say, I have confidence in God, but all of us know, we can speak words of confidence about God, but in our hearts sometimes we're like, oh man, I hope this is true. When I stand up here, and speak, I tend to speak probably with more confidence than I actually feel. But however confident I might seem when I'm standing here speaking, I can assure you I do not feel that confident in most of my life. And so Paul, what is he thinking on this boat? And he's close to them. And, remember, these are days when people aren't taking a bath in deodorant and shampoo. That's going to be a pretty smelly bunch of guys on that ship. And it's going to be crowded. He didn't have, this isn't a cruise ship. He's probably sleeping on the wooden deck, maybe if he's lucky, with the blanket underneath him. That is probably the best that he has. I doubt seriously he got some special bed. If there were any special beds, the captain of the ship got him, maybe the centurion. But I doubt Paul got any special treatment in terms of his living on this boat. He simply shared that. I rewatched this week something that I knew I shouldn't have done it, but because it was related to the sermon, I rewatched a little video clip. And of course, it made me angry, but some of you, I'm sure, have seen this or are aware of this. There are certain preachers or leaders, generally they have a great big kind of television production, and there's those categories that, they often asking for money, they become very rich. And, a few years ago, it was, at least in America, quite a controversy. Two of these guys talking about why they needed not just one private plane, but at least 2 private planes. Okay? Now, number one, that by itself is like, what? But to listen to them and their defense, why this was good for them, why they needed a private plane. And one of them is like, being in a plane, and the way he put it, it's like a long tube full of demons. That was the way he characterized other people on a plane. And then he said, being on a commercial jet, it ruins the anointing, he said. It ruins my anointing. Paul is on this ship with 276 people, about the number of people that might be on, a commercial airline, a larger airplane. About the same number of people, the same shape, the ship or the airline. And Paul followed the way of Jesus, not by escaping, not by finding his luxury private boat. Paul never did that because Jesus never did. Paul is following the way of Jesus. Okay, he is a model of what Jesus did and how Jesus would do it. It's not separation. I need to get away and somehow protect myself in my own airplane or my own space. And believe me, as an introvert, I really like my private space and personal space. That's an ongoing temptation for me. Where, for me, I've got to pick up my cross and get close to people. But it's a way of weakness. It's not a way of power and status and comfort. It's the opposite of that. And I there's times, because I'm a weak person, when I've sometimes thought, God, why are you doing this to me? Why couldn't you spare me this? I remember when I first came to Latvia years ago, and of course, in America, I've only used public transportation just a couple times, and then I came here where, I'm on trams and buses all the time, and that was very new to me, and that was like way out of my comfort zone. To be traveling on public transportation, and sometimes in the morning they were real packed, and there's all these bodies around me, But several times I'd be like going somewhere, like even for a Bible study or something, and I think I've got to get there, and I see the tram, and I'm 100 meters away, and I'm beginning to run, and I'm like, please leave the doors open, keep the doors open, just let me get on that thing. And the doors close, and I'm like literally 3 seconds away from getting on the bus or the tram, and I'm like, God, why did you do that to me? I'm here for you. You could have kept those doors open for 5 seconds. You created the universe. You could have kept the tram there. The driver could have been whatever, picking his nose and just. But that would happen, and I would often think, why? I'm here for God. Why isn't God sparing me this? Why do I have to experience what, of course, everyone experiences that? Just missing a public transportation. It's actually just life. Okay, and I don't have explanations for why sometimes God does spare people certain things, and most of you have times when God did something special for you and spared you something or provided something, or kept the tram there and you got on, okay? And so God does that sometimes, but he doesn't do it always. And we ought not to expect that. Okay, we should expect to share the life that everyone else shares. Not that we are treated specially, but we step down into the path that everyone else has to walk. And we get sick, we lose friends, some disaster happens, a car wreck, if we have a car, or whatever it is. We're going to experience all those things that everyone else experiences, and we know we're going to experience that because that's the way of Jesus. If we're following Jesus, then that's what we're going to experience, because the way is not mainly a way to heaven. It's the way of Jesus. It's the entire life that comes from Jesus, and certainly it ends in life with God eternally, but now it's the way of Jesus. And the way of Jesus is the way of the cross. Okay, and this is just one of the basic realities we've got to accept, and if we don't accept this, we're going to spend our lives in misery. We're going to keep expecting things that are not going to be fulfilled, and we're going to be disappointed. The way of Paul was the way of Jesus, and the way of Jesus was the way of the cross. I was just thinking, and I'm not sure this is even a good illustration, but when we were setting up, Kelvin and Dulon were here, and they were, by the way, they come early and they set things up, and they, all this work. But anyway, I guess Kelvin asked me about, the Ukraine situation. What do I expect? And I don't know. I thought by this Sunday, we might know what's going to happen. But we're still kind of waiting. I try to have hope, but we don't know. But if things go badly, and what if, here in Latvia we end up, having lots of refugees from Ukraine. And my question is, what are we going to do about that? Are we going to be ready? What if we have to change something, so that we can accommodate new people? What if we have to step out of what we're used to, what we're comfortable doing? Are we going to be ready to do that? I hesitate to say that because it's not like I'm issuing some warning or have some expectation or even have some plan or idea, but I just want us to think the way of Jesus is the way of the cross in our individual life and as a church, and it might mean not doing things just like we would like. What if we have lots of people and we can't fit into this room anymore again? And what if we have to move? What if we might have to move the service to the afternoon? For years, I've resisted afternoon service. I would really rather go to church service in the morning. Okay, but what if we needed to move the time of our service? Will we be willing to do that? Yeah, I'm not suggesting anything specific, but the question is critical. Will we walk in the way of the cross? Will we be willing to set down what's comfortable and convenient, for the sake of following Jesus and his mission? So again, Paul said, follow my example, but just like I follow Christ's. Okay, Paul's life followed the pattern of Jesus. Okay, and that's why we can learn a lot from Paul. Paul on the ship. If Paul could suffer these things, then it should be no surprise that we will. And if the gospel advanced in spite of Paul's circumstances, then we can have that hope. Okay? It's in our sufferings that we are a light. Okay? It's in our sufferings that we are a light. That's what people need to see in this world, not some special category of people who live this exalted life. What they need to see is people that are just like them and yet have a different hope in the same circumstances. Okay? Our suffering, our weakness, our troubles, those are our opportunity. That's when we can shine most brightly and be the biggest difference when things are the hardest. To finish up, I'm going to take a chance here. I'd like to sing this chorus that I think most of you know, and so I have the words ready, but I'm not a singer. But if I know there's a couple of you who have nicer voices, I kind of prepared Vineta, and Dwight's got a not so bad voice either, and Isaac is here. So if someone could just get us started, I'd just like to finish up by singing this simple chorus together. Yeah. Yeah. Father, thank you that you have allowed us to join the way and join what you're doing. And thank you that it's not a path you simply send us on, but it's a path that you are on yourself. And that Jesus is by our side, and he's close, and he leads the way, and it's a path with Jesus. I pray, Lord, that we would walk with Jesus, and even when it's dark, we would walk with Jesus. Thank you that there's hope at the end of that path, and thank you that now our lives can make a difference as we walk with you. I pray now this week, bless our steps, and I pray that we would make a difference in the world. Amen. All right, thanks for being here. There's some coffee and hot water still. Make sure you talk to at least one person before you take off, and God willing, see you next Sunday.